the assessments through the Principled Assessment of Computational Thinking project for several years now. And so today we have a few members of our team for the assessment development team. So I'm Daisy Retzstein, and I've been working on this project probably about 4 years now. And I'll have my colleagues introduce themselves as well.
Hi, I'm Reina Fuji. I just joined the team in the last year, but I've been helping with the the development of the rubrics and assessments.
I'm Michelle, and I've also been on the team for about a year, and I've been mainly helping with the assessments, developing the rubrics and the items.
So if you have questions throughout, feel free to put them in the chat window, and somebody will either respond to them there, or when we have time for questions, we will get to your questions there. In general, the way this is going to work is we're going to give a brief overview of some of the rubrics, and then we're just going to delve right in and do some examples. We picked 2 examples from Unit 1 and 3 examples from Unit 2. These were some of the questions that when we were scoring the last round that we had some of the most interesting discussions around, so we thought those would be good to present. If we have time at the end and people have other questions or items that they want to talk about, we're happy to discuss those. So just briefly, the assessments that we're talking about, are the assessments for the ECS curriculum. We have 5 assessments that we're developing, 4 of which have now been released, and those are the end of the units for units 1 through 4. And then we'll be releasing a cumulative assessment that covers a general overview of the topics in unit 1 through 4, and that'll be released next month. We're currently only going to talk about units 1 and 2 and at this point. But one thing to note about the assessments is that they're focused a lot on the computational thinking practices. So some of the examples that we have and that you'll see in the scoring focuses on looking at the student's ability to engage in the practice more than whether or not they have very specific knowledge about some of the details in there. So a little bit just about the rubrics, and then we're going to see some examples. All of the rubrics are split into 2 main sections. The first section is the quick scoring guide, and this just provides a general overview of the points. So once you're familiar with how to score, you can just kind of look at that for guidelines. And then there's the detailed scoring guide, which gives further clarifications on how to assign the points, gives some examples, tries to explain like what we're looking for in each of the items. So in the quick scoring guide, what you'll see is you'll see the name of the task, and then you'll see the learning objective from the unit that we're aligned to. And so when we develop the items, we might have aligned to only part of we've split some of the learning objectives up for our own internal purposes. So you'll see that you might have multiple tasks aligned to the same learning objective that cover kind of different aspects of that learning objective. And then what we have is we have an overview of the points. So there's the total points for that item and then how that's broken down. Okay, so we'll get into item 1, or unit 1, item 2, and then after we discuss this rubric, we'll have a time for questions on this item, or if you have any questions about the rubrics in general. So on unit 1, item 2, the question gives the students a set of instructions, and then the first thing we ask them to do is to talk about why a robot would have difficulty completing that step, and then we ask them to rewrite that step. So in the detailed scoring guide, you'll also, again, see the task name, and you'll see the learning objective, and then you'll see the rubric broken out. And so for the first part on this item, where we're asking them to look at the 3 steps and pick one of the steps that they think a robot would have difficulty, there are multiple correct answers here. And what we're really looking at is their explanation, and are they looking for things about precision or clarity, so a robot would have difficulty interpreting this instruction. So that's why they would have difficulty completing the step. Or is it something that's very subjective? that, when you're talking about a hat that matches, well, that's kind of subjective. Different people might interpret that different ways. And so a couple examples here, and you'll notice that one of them is in green and got a green box, and that indicates that this is an acceptable answer. It's not always, some of the ones we included aren't the greatest answers, but we would still score them as correct, whereas the ones in the red box as we go through, those are ones that we would not accept. So for the first part, we have a student who said that they would, the robot would have difficulty completing the taking out a t-shirt, and they include in their description that, hey, there's many different ones, and so they're getting at the idea of precision and clarity, that it's not specific. You don't know which one that you actually want the robot to pick. In the second one, where they start indicating that when they start saying, how would a robot know what shirt to pick, but they don't really go into enough detail about it. They talk more about, the shirt might not match, and that's not really explaining that it's not precise or that it's not, or that it's subjective. They just don't really quite go into those details, and their explanation is somewhat confusing. And then for 2B, this is where we have them rewrite their steps, and we want them to rewrite it in a way that addresses their concern. So if they talk about the precision or the clarity in the previous one, we're hoping that their answer here is more precise. Or if they talk about subjectivity, that they find a way to kind of remove that subjectivity. So in the first one, we had a student who said it wasn't precise enough, and then they, create a very specific, this is exactly the t-shirt I want them to pick. And then in the second one, though they were talking about it being subjective, but then they take out the hat that matches the red shirt, which is still something that's subjective. So we would not accept that. So, so that was Unit 1, Item 2. So are there any questions about the sort of what you see in the rubric? Are there any questions about this item? Does anybody have any examples of their student work that they would like to share, and if they have questions on how they were scored? And as we're going through the items, you're free to also put stuff in the chat window if you have student examples in there. Okay. Well, if there's no questions at this time, we can go to the next item. And then, but feel free if you want to revisit some of the previous items that we've talked about. Okay. So, so the next item that we were going to talk about was Unit 1, Item 3. And this is an item where we're asking them about the different ways that they can communicate and asking them to compare that. So we have that they can communicate using, or that they're communicating on social media. We ask them to list 2 pieces of personal information and then pick one of those pieces of information and describe a consequence of somebody you don't know accessing that information, and then describe a benefit, and then describe a privacy concern. So trying to get at some of those coverage of the legal and ethical and privacy concerns. So for the first part, when we ask them to provide an appropriate piece of information, what we found is most students who put something down that we would accept. So there were some students who just left it blank, but a lot of it was just anything that you would might consider personal. So the most common things that we saw were addresses, were pictures, were phone numbers, were emails, were things like, oh, my preferences and what I like or don't like. And so the main thing is that they get a point for each of those, and they just have to be different from each other. So I don't have examples for that one because mainly what we the examples that we found are the ones that are listed there. And then for 3B, when we talk about asking them, so what would happen if, what's the consequence of a stranger accessing that personal information, we expect them to relate the consequence to whichever one they pick there. And so it should be an actual, like something that they wouldn't want to have happen. So one of the most common things we saw was when people were talking about the address, or they talked about where I might be, like what school I go to, is that, hey, somebody might track me down and find me and do something bad to me. So that was really one of the most common things that we found. But some of the things that we saw that weren't correct are things where, in the last one, they talk more about how you would prevent the consequence. So they talk about, okay, there's, you know, if you go on the site, it'll show information, but if you change your privacy setting, that's fine. Then it won't show that. So they aren't actually saying what's the consequence of somebody you know coming across that information. They're talking about how to prevent it, and so they're not actually addressing the question. Okay. And then we ask them to describe a benefit of communicating via social media. And so a lot of this was about, oh, you can either talk to a whole bunch of people at the same time, or in this case, the student was saying, hey, there's people that I haven't seen in a long time. I don't know how to get in touch with them, but through social media, I can get in touch with them. Some of the things we wouldn't accept was, like, if they just said, communicate with friends, where we ask them, what's the benefit of communicating, and they sort of respond, well, I can communicate. They have to go into a little more detail than just, well, I can communicate, and explain, you know, what is it about social media that kind of gives them that extra boost. And then the last part of this was an appropriate description of a legal, ethical, or privacy concern. So this is where we didn't want them to specifically say, you know, this is illegal, this is unethical, this is privacy, but we did want them to think about what are the issues when you're posting things online. So, so some of the things that we were looking for was that you might get negative comments, or there's things that might, you know, people are going to find out about your personal opinions, or that you might hurt somebody's feelings, which is more an ethical concern, and sort of accessing information stored on the site. So what are the things on the site that they might be concerned about? So, you know, we found a lot of it was like, oh, well, if people can find out what I put on there, they can put it anywhere. You know, once it's on there, you can't really get rid of it, and you can't take things down, and so you have to be careful who sees what you see. We got some that were more, they just sort of stated kind of it was more of the consequence versus the concern. So like, you can get hacked, but you know, what we would have wanted them to say is what goes beyond that. Why is that a concern? And then there were some that were more just, oh, well, like this kid who, it's not really a legal, ethical, or privacy concern. The fact that they have to sign something boring didn't really seem to fit into any of those categories. So are there any questions about this item or any of the previous items? And so, okay. So there's one question in the chat window about, for the previous item, for 3A and 3B, do students ever not connect it to the first response? So most of what we saw was that they were able to take what they wrote in 3A and repeat it in 3B. I believe we tended to score that as long as the concern was, or the privacy information that they were talking about was clear, that we could still give them credit for 3B. Are there any other questions? And you're welcome to type it in the chat box, or you can unmute your phone and just say the question out loud if that's easier. Okay, so there's a question about, do we want students to give details on the subject? So, and then there's another question about where can I find these assessments. So just the second question is you can access the assessment through the CS10K site, and I believe you have to join the ECS group there, and then you can get those. So do we want students to give details on the subject? So we want them to give some details. So we want them to give enough details that we can see that they understand sort of what's a concern, what types of things might be considered a benefit. We don't expect them to go into a lot of details. Part of that is that's also what we found, is that students didn't really go into a lot of details. Do you have any specific examples of or types of details that you were thinking of? Okay. If you'd like to read the example that you have from your student out loud, you can unmute your phone and then we can all hear what the student said, or you're welcome to type it. But
How do you unmute?
*6 to unmute. Okay. So for 3D, it says people can see what you do in your private life. So we're looking at that as a legal, ethical, or privacy concern. So that, I guess we would consider that a privacy concern. And it's true, they don't go into the details on why that was a concern, but they do list that as a concern. Here, yeah. Okay. So we do consider that a description of a concern, and since we didn't ask them to go into why it's a concern, and we can understand that they're talking about its private information and private life, that could be a privacy concern. So, yeah. So for now, we would kind of be loose and accept it. That would be on one of those on the fence kind of thing. Okay. All right, so now we're going to move on to Unit 2, but if we have time at the end, we can go back and look at any other items on Unit 1 that people would like to discuss. So the first item in Unit 2 that we'll talk about is question 3. And so this was where we give students a picture, and the first thing we do is ask them to describe that pattern, so they can recreate the pattern for a banner of any size. And then after we ask them that, we give them 2 methods where we're asking them, when a new banner comes in, what would you do? Would you just draw it out each time to figure out how many panels you need, or would you create a mathematical formula? And what we're really hoping is that all students will say mathematical formula, but what we want to concentrate there is why that's important. So why is it important to think about formulas when you're creating these kind of things? So for the first one, it's mainly we're just looking for a clear description of the pattern, but one of the things we want to focus on is that from that description, there's some idea that you can generalize this pattern out so that it's not just specific to the 3x3 format. So in the first one, the first response that we would accept, they talk about the first row beginning with the school mascot, and then they alternate, so they get that you're kind of alternating. They talk about the second row alternating as well, and so you can see that it's a little more general, and then they talk about the next row as a repeat of the first. They don't go quite as far to say that going down the rows keeps repeating, but they had enough there that we said, okay, they're getting the general pattern, and they're talking about it in a general sense, so that was fine. Whereas in the second response, they're very specific to the 3x3 grid. So they talk about, okay, the top left, the top right, the bottom left, bottom right, and the middle, and then the other one is the other panels would be the other school, would be the school logo, which if you generalized it out isn't actually how the pattern would work. So we decided that that was incorrect. And then for 3B, we do give them a point for selecting method 2, even though we hope that most students will select that. And then we do look at their explanation. So what we're looking at is what are the benefits of the formula, and so thinking about, well, it's systematic, it's quicker, it's something that you can automate or program in, and it's possibly more accurate than if you were just to draw it out. They could also talk about this, so from the perspective of, well, if I chose method 1, it would be really slow. I'd have to, draw everything out, and that could take a long time. So kind of thinking about the inverse, the opposite of what method 2 was. And of course, if they compared the two, that would be even better. So we saw things like method 2 would be easier and faster. And so we said, okay, that was good. Whereas a lot of the wrong responses that we saw to this one was they just gave the formula. So they tried to come up with the formula, and they weren't really going into an explanation of why one method was better than the other. They were just trying to give the formula. And this is one where if they gave the formula and then they explained why the formula would be useful, we would have given it credit even if the formula was wrong. We didn't want the task to actually require them to get a correct formula. In this case, the formula is somewhat difficult because of the odd and even issue. So we basically would have ignored the formula and scored the rest, which is why if they only gave the formula, it's incorrect. So are there any questions about this question? Okay, well, I guess I will move on to the next one. Oh, wait. there might be a question. So what do you do if you can't read a student response, and how do you deal with this? That's a very good question. Pretty much we do the best we can. So a lot of times we'll look around for, sometimes it's just one word that you can't understand, and then you can kind of get the gist of what they're saying. And if the gist makes sense and seems to be appropriate, then you'll go with it. Otherwise, at some point, if the handwriting's too bad, we just couldn't score it, and you can't give them credit for it. And yes, we do require a lot of writing in this. We really wanted students to be able to engage in explanation and descriptions, and so that's part of why we required a bunch of writing. But we do know that that makes it difficult sometimes when we're scoring. Okay. Okay. So we'll move on to, oh.
Go back to the units, the items.
So all of the answers that we have in here are from examples that are from actual student responses that we saw on our previous pilot. So everything we have here, and again, if you have your own personal examples of your students that you'd like to share with the group, you're welcome to unmute and share them, or type them in as we go through, and we're happy to talk about how we would score them. But all of the examples that we have in here are from actual student responses. Okay. Okay. All right, so we'll move on to our food bank item. And this is the item where we actually want them to kind of create their own algorithm. So, so the first part is we give them a scenario where there's a food bank and cans are all disorganized, and so they have trouble finding what they need. And so the first question is trying to get at, can you understand what the problem is? So we ask them what the problem is, and then we ask them to create a method. And then once they create a method, we ask them, what did you need to know about the problem? So kind of what are one of the inputs to the problem? And then what is the result of applying the method? Do you understand what the output is? And then looking a little bit at if there's a new type of food, thinking about your algorithm that the student created, will your algorithm still work, or is there some way that you need to modify it? So for the first one, we were really looking for, the main problem is that the shelves are not organized or that it takes a long time to pack the boxes. So in our first response, we had, the students take a long time packing the boxes because the cans aren't organized, so that was great. Whereas in the second one of the wrong answers we had was that Stacy can't make food boxes. So the problem isn't that she can't make them, it's that it's time-consuming to make them because things are not organized. So we wouldn't have accepted that. So in the second one, we asked them to actually create an algorithm. And so when we were going through the items, what we really were trying to look for is basically that the algorithm has two main parts. So one is how would they group the cans? So kind of how would you sort the cans to make it easier? And then the other part for how would you put the cans back on the shelf? So looking at where they actually go. So a very nice response that we had was where they actually labeled things as steps and said, you take everything off, you sort the cans based on the food type. So that was important that they talked about how the cans would be sorted, and then they talk about how you have you're labeling the shelves, and then you put the cans back in their areas. So here we have two more responses that on the surface look very similar, but there's enough differences in here that one of them was scored correct and one of them was scored with partial credit. So for the first one, they talk about organize the cans by their type. So again, they're minimal response here, but they're saying, hey, I would sort the cans and I would do that by the type of the cans. And then I would put the cans back on the shelf based on the type of food. So they're talking about how they would keep them grouped when they put them back on the shelves. Whereas the second one, they talk about labeling the shelf with each type of food, and they say sort the food, but they don't explain how you would sort the food. So they don't give sort of that criteria there. So here they would still get a point for discussing kind of where the food would go, because they're talking about kind of how you would label the shelf, but they don't get the point for how they would organize the cans. So then for 5C, when we ask them to identify the variables, so this is basically, what do you need to know? And so we have a list there of some of the things that we did see and that we would accept. So like type of food and number of the types of food, number of the cans, the number of the shelves, the amount of space on the shelves, things that might affect where you would put the cans on the shelves. So the first, some of the good responses were I would need to know that there were 4 types of canned foods, whereas one of the responses that we got was that to create a method, Stacy needs to know where the shelves are. And so she doesn't really need to know, for the method to work, to be able to sort the cans and put them on the shelf, you don't necessarily need to know where the shelves themselves are. You need to know more about the dimensions of the shelves. And so then we asked them sort of what's the result of applying this method. And we were looking for the main thing is once you apply the method is that your shelves are actually organized. And you can find this, or mainly we're looking for that it's organized. So the first response has that it's organized. Whereas the second one talks about that Stacy will complete the boxes faster. And so while that's true, that's more the consequence of once the algorithm has been applied, the shelves are organized, and then you can, then you can, based on that, you can complete the boxes faster, but that's more the consequence, and that's not the direct result and the direct output of the algorithm. And then the last one is where we have them reflecting on their algorithm. And so here, a lot of this is going to depend on what their algorithm is that they created. So if their algorithm was very dependent on the type of foods, or, hey, I have 4 types, so therefore my new algorithm won't work because there's a new type, they need to sort of discuss that. Or other students might have a more general algorithm, and so they would say that, yes, it does work, and then they could explain why. So in this case, for the first one, we had that their method would not work, but then they go and they explain that, okay, we would just make a new category for where it would work. And we saw that, and we have another one that's pretty similar to that. So that was a lot of what we saw, whereas some students didn't bother with the explanation at all and just said, no, the method wouldn't work. So are there any questions or examples that people would like to share about this item? Okay. So then the next one that we have, and this is the last one that we have, but we also are welcome to talk about any of the other items that people would like to talk about after this one. So, and this is our clubs item from Unit 2, so it's item 4, where we give the students a list of children who are going to select their clubs, and we give them an algorithm, which is if every student was assigned their first choice, but to solve the problem that, and in this case, each club can have at most 3 students. So we ask them to decide if that would work and explain their answer. And then we give them one method of solving this, and we ask them to actually go through this method and apply it and give us the output. And then we give them a second method, and we say, okay, now use this method and go through the algorithm and apply it and show us the results. And here we give them a little bit of scaffolding to kind of help them through there. And then we ask them, would each of these methods solve the problem? And this was strictly a yes or no. We didn't ask for an explanation, mainly because when we piloted it the first time, we had an explanation, but we didn't really learn anything from there. So we just asked them to say yes or no. And then we asked them which method would make the most students happy with their club assignment, and we did want them to explain their answer there. So for the first one, what we were looking for is for them to say no, and for them to explain why, which was mainly that it violates the constraint that all clubs can have no, or a club can have no more than 3 students. So in the first case here, they said there are 5 people who want Club A, so that wouldn't solve the problem. In the next one, they said something very similar, but here they said 4 people would want to be in Club A, and there can be at most 3. And we would still give them credit for this because because even though, yes, there are 5 students who'd want to be in Club A, and they said only 4, it's more about that they recognize that it violates the constraints. And it could be that they counted and got to 4 and just answered. So we would give them credit for that. In the last case, we had a student who was sort of hinting at it. It said there are 4 students, and there's a maximum can have is 3 students, but then they say, so if all students had their choices, the other 2 clubs would be empty, and that's not the issue. The issue isn't that the other 2 clubs would be empty. The issue is that you can't have 4 students in a club, and they didn't quite make that jump there, so we would not have given them credit for that. So for the next 3 are somewhat more straightforward to score. It's not as subjective of reading their response. So here there's 9 students, and we have the correct placement of where they should all be, and so they just get 2 points if they're all correct, and if they get mostly correct, so 7 or 8, then they would get 1 point. And similarly for 4C, for method 2, in this case, there's a couple different ways they could have gotten the answer correct. There's not just only one correct answer, but as long as they have all 9 students correct in a correct placement, then they would get the 2 points. But if they mixed up a couple, they would not. They would only get 1 point. And then for 4D, the yes or no, they get a point for selecting yes. And then for the last one, there's a couple different ways that they could get this correct. So they hopefully will pick, they get a point for selecting method 2 as the correct method. And then the main reasons why method 2 would make the most students happy is, one, that there's no student that gets their 3rd place choice, so every student gets their 1st or their 2nd choice. But additionally, there's also more students get their first place or first choice club than with method 1. So they could state either of those reasons, and that would be perfectly fine. And they could state it either as a positive for method 2 or as a negative for method 1. So we had the students say, because in method 1, some students got their last choice, which wouldn't be as good as their 2nd choice. And so that was perfectly fine. And then in some incorrect answers, they would talk about method 1 being first come, first serve, which is the fairest, which didn't quite make sense to us. There were some students who talked about, oh, well, that one goes alphabetically, so that makes it fairer, which we didn't think was quite correct. And they talked here about that everyone gets at least their second choice, but they picked method 1, so it wasn't true for method 1. So if they had picked method 2 and said that everyone gets their second choice, we would have accepted it. But because they picked the wrong method, we couldn't really accept their explanation. So are there any questions on this item? And also, if there aren't questions on this one specifically, but you can also ask any questions on any of the items from Unit 1 or Unit 2. If there's anything that you would like to go over, we still have some time. Okay. Oh, well, that's good to hear. And again, we have plenty of time. So if there are additional questions, if there's any student responses that you had from any of the items, if there's additional items you'd like to talk about, feel free to let us know, and we can use some of the time for your questions.
Okay. Do you have any other examples or comments that you wanna share? Oh.
I mean, from our end, we're happy to share anything. Okay.
Oh, there's a comment in from Alina. 3 of her students found this type of assessment difficult.
Do you know, like, what was it? The fact that they had to do a lot of explanation? If there were particular things that they found difficult, that might be interesting to know. We do know that sometimes this format with the short answer can be a little more difficult for students, but we did feel that it was important to really get at trying to understand what they were thinking and how they were engaging in these problems. Yeah, that's a good point, is that we definitely wanted to include some questions where there wasn't a straightforward yes or no answer. So that was actually kind of on purpose, and I do understand that that can be difficult, but when we're trying to get them to be explaining and describing and thinking about things in a more than just a black and white way, we kind of felt that that was important.
So we'll stay on for another 10 minutes or so. So feel free to type your questions or comments. I'm gonna just give you a few announcements before we go, but again, feel free to jump in with any questions, type your comments. We want to thank the team at SRI for sharing this information and leading the discussion. If you're not already a member, we encourage you to join us on the community at cs10k.community.org. I put the link in the chat. And subscribe to the ECS Open Group to access these assessments and lots of other great information. We have lots of great free webinars and events every month that you can access from our events page. Our next ECS-themed webinar is March 22nd, a continuation of creating an action plan for broadening participation. We also hope you'll join us next Monday for our February Twitter chat at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. We'll be discussing the CS for All initiative. So thanks again for everyone who joined. Again, we'll stay on for another 10 minutes or so feel free to ask any questions or comments. Thank you.